So what are we discussing? We're discussing deselection, deacquisition, discarding, and weeding. These are all the same terms for the same thing that one is doing. I like to use the term weeding because I feel it's the most relatable to the public and to the staff. Even if one is not a gardener, you kind of understand what it means to weed. So weeding allows for understandable analogies. So, I'm really sorry. I guess I shouldn't even look at the screen over there because it's going to drive me nuts. So, what I have here is, you can see there's two photos. One is a photo of a garden, but it's overrun with weeds. You can't see what's behind there. You can't see the flowers. You can't see what you're meant to see. Versus the other photo, you can see is a nice manicured lawn. You can see the flowers are in the shape of Mickey Mouse. It's very evident what's there. So when you think about your collections and the shelves, if you think about the overgrown garden that's just, shelves just crammed, book after book after book, or CD after CD, you can't see what's there. You don't have an attractive collection, and that's why you need to weed. So, you want to eliminate shelving that causes barriers to browsing and finding items and looks like this first photo on the top. You want to create shelving that provides visible access to the collection and looks more attractive. So you want to weed your collection so that you can have face out, so that folks can see what you have. So what I'm showing you is the item on the left are some kits, and there's about 4 or 5 kits here, and they all have cassette tapes. Now the cassette tapes are items that our library no longer had, but yet we managed to have a few items here that had cassette tapes. Then on the other slide is one playaway. So about a year ago, I discovered this one lone playaway in our audiobook collection. So again, why do you want to weed? You want to make sure that you have items that really truly represent your collection. You don't want these lone things just floating out there. Some other reasons you might want to weed is you want to eliminate duplication. You want to create access to a more relevant collection. So in this case, we have 2 copies of Charles Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. Now, one of these is clearly much more attractive and is probably going to interest your users more so than the, now you can't see it, but there's a black and white older version. So again, sometimes with your classics, you want to weed them to get a more attractive, newer edition that just the cover looks more presentable and is going to attract your audience better. If you're a teen, a teen is not going to be attracted to a black and white cover. They're going to want something that pops a little bit more. Another reason to weed. Age. This is a big one. Many times we get very emotionally involved in our collections and we don't want to let them go. But when you have something that says making money with your computer at home and it looks like this, it's time to let it go. Some of you may be familiar with the Crew Guidelines, which are really useful, and they have some information in the Crew Guidelines that talks about the age of different collections. So things like computer books, they should only be a couple years old. You don't want a computer book sitting on your shelf that's, around from the beginning. In the other photo I have here is a children's elementary dictionary, and the same thing. You want to think about the age of the items that you're presenting to your public. So in the case of the dictionary, I opened it up and I looked for 2 words. I looked for internet and I looked for World Wide Web. Guess what? Neither were in the dictionary, and I'm sure some of you have experienced this before. Get rid of it. It's not providing information to your public. So you want to keep your collection accessible to all by providing accurate information. You want to make sure your collection is not a barrier to learning, such as the case of providing children a dictionary that does not have current relevant information. Why do we weed? Well, incorrect information equals barriers to knowledge. So you can see on the left-hand side, I have covers of 2 astronomy books. Well, on both of the books, and you can't quite see it, but on both of them, it mentions the year 2010. So again, last year when I encountered these, I thought, here we go again, folks. The 2010 expiration date was on the cover. That's an easy way for you to know it's time to let these books go. Astronomy is something that changes. If people are consulting field guides, star guides, planetary guides, that information changes. So you want to make sure that you have that most current information to your patrons. The other book on the right has a couple other things going on with it. One is, it says the Bengal Tiger. Now, I would expect a book about the Bengal Tiger to maybe have a picture of a tiger on the cover. Again, when you talk about what is going to draw your patrons in, what is going to be attractive to them, you want to think about what something looks like. So clearly, and I don't have the publication date on this Bengal Tiger, but it is quite an old book. And I have a little caption there that I had. And I'm just going to read it to you. And it says, at the rate it's being killed, the tiger will be extinct by the year 2000. So, fortunately, we still have Bengal tigers in this world. But sadly, if some child or some, high school student had picked up this book last year, they would have been reading some really incorrect information, and hopefully nobody was using this book for a report in the last few years that it sat on our shelves, because clearly they would have been writing an erroneous report. This dinosaur dictionary had a publication date of 1972. And again, going back to some of the crew guidelines, per standard library practices, items in the Dewey range for dinosaurs should be no more than 5 years old. So clearly us having had this dinosaur dictionary from 1972, yes, it's fun to look at, but it's, again, not providing relevant information to our public. So why do you weed? If you want to provide the most accurate collection to your patrons, this bears repeating. Check for age of your collection. Another reason to weed is just general collection. In the item on the left-hand side, that's a cover of a book in which it had this gross, disgusting smudge on it, and it was sitting on our shelves. So there again, that's a barrier to people accessing information, because if they were to pull that off the shelf, I don't know, I think most of us would go yuck and not want to take this item home. Another example of reading for collection is the book on the left. You can see that there's some yellow stains running through it. Don't know what those were. So this was a dual case of age. One, it was a 1955 publication about the life of Marie Antoinette, but it also had some unknown substance on it. So again, you want to take care of what you're providing to your patrons. This is another example of a damaged item. I found this in our children's area. It appeared to me that maybe perhaps this was an item that a patron had at one point mended themselves. Oh, I think we lost it again. If you look at the way that the pages are taped together, and it looks like yellow construction paper was used, and I would hope that nobody who had actually been an employee had actually mended a book in this fashion. But so again, you want to look for damaged items on your shelf and make sure that you weed those. And I'm just going to keep plugging along even though we're losing this. So you want to create room for newer information, newer resources on a topic. So this biography of Cesar Chavez that had been in our children's area had a 1991 publication date. And as you can see, it had an open-ended date from 1927 with no death date. He died 2 years after this publication was created, and yet this was sitting on our shelves. So again, there's newer biographies of Cesar Chavez that we can provide our youth rather than an outdated information. Okay. So I know you can't quite see the captions here, but if you look at this images, or not, if you look at the clothing that the girls are wearing, it's very 1970s. And the caption says, "I can play it at home on our phonograph." Wow, what a sound that will be. Then the next caption shows a little boy, and it says, "I think I will borrow this record because I like marching bands and parades." And in the background, you can see it shows a shelf that says records. Well, yes, LPs are, some folks really like LPs again, and they do. I know some libraries are bringing LPs back. But again, in terms of terminology, records, and just looking at how the people are dressed, this is not something a little kid is going to have relevance to. Then this continues on, and it shows the kid in the library. He's like, "My mom is downstairs. She's looking for a book to borrow and read." Okay, that's all well and good. But then the next photograph, which I really wish I could show you, the next illustration, looks like now we've really lost it. Okay, this next illustration, "While I wait for my mother, I watch a librarian check out books. There is a special machine to put library cards in. I wonder how it works." So you can see this is from 1970, and the librarian's checking the book in with one of those old check-in machines. So again, that has no relevance to the youth of today. It might be important for them to learn how libraries once worked, but really, what little kid is going to want to look at this book? So keep yourself from being in a time warp. Use weeding to create a collection of relevant information. So those are some basic reasons on why you weed for basic maintenance of your collection, but sometimes you have to weed for other reasons. So sometimes you might need to weed because you're having a renovation. So in the upper photograph, you can see some yellow pieces of carpet. That's where, in my library, we had a small renovation. We got some new shelving, but we also lost a lot of our shelving. And so we had to weed to accommodate the decreased shelving. So that was like a quick weeding project we had to do. Sometimes you might have to do a weeding of your collection. Maybe you're converting to a new ILS system, and so you just have to clean up your database and clean up records. So that's another type of weeding that maybe you might think about, that taking a look at your database and just seeing what is in your database compared to what's actually on the shelf. And sometimes you might need to do weeding, such as I'm involved in right now, because you're converting to RFID. And so we're having to weed a lot of items just to make sure that we're not tagging and coding items that we're going to weed in a month or two anyhow. So this other last photograph on the bottom shows an example of when we were weeding to create space for our renovation and losing our shelving. One of the things that I had to do was just give some real quick information and guidelines to staff and just say, if this book is X amount of years old, pull it, and just, so we had a bunch of items here that were so old in our collection, and fortunately we got them off the shelves. So if you don't weed, eventually you're going to be overrun by materials. Don't use the excuse of keeping a certain number of volumes per capita as an excuse not to weed. If you weed, you will enable patrons to find materials. You will have better visibility of the collections. You will create a more relevant collection. When you weed, bear in mind staff feelings. Bear in mind that there may be some historical knowledge people have as to why things weren't weeded in the past. And when you weed, remember that some things do not fit the typical weeding guidelines and may need to be kept. So things like local history, local information, books about your local flora and fauna, local guidebooks, books written by local authors or people of note in your community. Those might be things that you do want to keep, possibly forever. So ultimately, remember to have a goal of what is going to stay in your collection and what your ultimate vision for the collection is. Thank you.
So, like a lot of libraries out there, by the time things started to pick up after the recession, we hadn't done a whole lot of weeding in about 8 years or so. We were hanging on to things that were really grubby and really out of date, and staff were understandably scared that if they let go of things that we wouldn't be able to replace them. So shelves were really overcrowded, and as we became able to buy more materials, we found that a lot of the libraries didn't have room on the shelves for them. So the scope of the work that we needed to do was really overwhelming. I need to get where I am. Oh, the buzzing is gone. Thank you. So everybody was really overwhelmed. They didn't know where to start. They didn't know how to prioritize. Our previous method of weeding had been to look at things about once a year in the spring, and we'd alternate between looking at grubby materials and dead or dusty materials, but we realized that that wasn't going to work for the magnitude of weeding that we had to do. So we realized that we needed to have a plan in place that would make weeding a regular monthly thing that we could sort of break into manageable chunks. Excuse my voice, the smoke is getting to me. So I took a look in both Collection HQ and in our ILS to figure out which collection areas were the most impacted and whether or not our main problem was with the grubby materials or the dusty materials. So that first year it was really grubby materials all across the board. So to make sure that those items were actually still on shelf, I started with an inventory report in Collection HQ called Collection Check that shows you everything that hasn't served in at least 4 years. So a lot of those items typically aren't on your shelves anymore, and so it's a great way to clean up your ILS. So I recommend starting with something like that when you're beginning your weeding program. And then I assign different areas to each month, of course keeping in mind our yearly programming trends, so we don't want to try to weed juvenile materials during summer reading, for example. And that first year we were pretty successful. Our juvenile grubby fiction went down from about 20% to about 13%, and our juvenile grubby AB materials went down from about 28% to about 8%. So you can set a target for yourself that makes sense for your library, especially if you have a lot to do. Collection HQ typically has a target of 10% for just about everything, so that's what we're shooting. After we cleared that up, our next largest problem definitely was dead materials in adult nonfiction. Probably doesn't surprise any of you. So we've been working on that for the past couple of years, and it's getting better. But as we're weeding, we're also observing, as you probably are, a drop in circulation for these materials. So we're weeding, and we're buying a little bit less, and we're trying to be more targeted about what we buy. So something else that really helps with weeding and messaging the need for weeding to staff in particular is something that we call our deselection guidelines chart. Let's see, sorry, lost my place. So we set standards for how long we want to keep materials in our library. It depends a lot on publication date and last use. It's very helpful to have these guidelines in place for timely materials like travel and medical and other things. It's also a great help to have for AV so that everybody knows when it's time to let go of a DVD, for example. So this first slide shows you kind of our formula. So it's years since publication date and years since last circ. So if you look at the line of computers, it's 3 years since pub date and 1 year since the last circulation. And you don't have to be a stickler to this. This is just a guideline that helps staff kind of know when it's time to review something. So this next slide gives you an idea of how we do audiovisual. We used to have it broken out by format and had different guidelines for each format, but about a year or so ago we switched to just 100 circs across the board for everything. So that kind of gives staff an understanding of when it's time for things to kind of retire and when to take a look at things for condition in particular. So each month I send out these reports to, sorry, went too far. Send out the reports to the libraries, and it's got the report included for the month and what we're doing, give them a little bit of guidance about what's going on, any special information if they have a special collection or something else going on in their particular libraries. And all the staff have to do is print the report out and pull the materials. Because different people have different comfort levels with things like Collection HQ, and we didn't want that to be a barrier. So we just started out with sending it out to people, and that's been a big help. We've gotten a good response from that. People feel a little less overwhelmed by the work. They can just get right to it instead of worrying about, do I know how to generate this report myself? So that's been a big help. Although we assign the weeding work in our system mostly to professional staff, we send the reports out to everybody because we want to make sure that all staff understand what we're doing, why we're weeding, and how we're doing it. A lot of people who go to work in libraries never really thought about how materials leave the library or why they would even need to. So they come sometimes in with an assumption that it's their responsibility or the library's mission, particularly in the public library, to keep everything forever. They don't realize that that's not something we do. So it's important to acknowledge that many of your staff have no experience or training in this area, and you might be teaching them about this for the very first time. So because of that, it's really important if you send out reports like this that you want to stress to staff that you're not saying you want them to pull everything on the report and withdraw it. That this is something that they need to just take a look at these items and see if they're candidates for withdrawal. There's just no substitute for professional judgment. So these are tools, and the people do the thinking. You want to remember to try to have patience with staff fears around this. Our profession tends to attract people who are keepers and savers, and that has value. But the other side of that is that there are some tough emotions that come out around feelings of loss with weeding. We love what we do. We love our collections. We take it personally, and it can be really difficult to let things go. You want to make sure to give a lot of feedback and to celebrate all your successes, no matter how small. This work can take a long time, and if you're kind of as backed up as we were, it's not going to happen overnight. So you just want to be patient with yourself and with everybody in the process. So definitely share how things are going. Every year we send out an email to kind of celebrate how we've done. So before you start this weeding, it's really important to have a plan in place for what you're going to do with your discards, and make sure that the plan has been approved by your governing body. That makes talking points very easy if you get questions from the public and the media about your process. So we worked with our Board of Supervisors quite a few years ago now, I think it's been over 20 years, to create an annual public giveaway. And that's what this shows, is our flyer from this year's giveaway. So, excuse me. Staff in the branches will box up the discards throughout the year, kind of loosely by collection area. And then our shipping staff take it to a central location, and then that's where we hold the giveaway every year for about a week in August. So the first day we'll have teachers and schools come in and take their pick of things, and then the rest of the week we just have the public come in and take it away as much as they want. We have people come with wagons, dollies, trucks, and they just come and take it all away. The thinking behind that was that we wanted the materials to go back to the public who paid for them, and we wanted to do it in such a way that the majority of our service area could participate. But that's really only one thing that you might do with your discards. A lot of library systems have an agreement with their local school district to give them the discards, and that works particularly well if you've got a single district in your service area. If you have multiple districts, like we happen to have 19, so that wouldn't really work for us, but if you have a single district, it's a great idea. Some libraries will give their discards to their friends, which is a great way to make additional money for your library, of course. And I think it's often this way with county libraries, but sometimes you can't, there are rules about the kind of revenue that you can receive. So there are companies out there, such as Better World Books and Thrift Books. This is not sponsored. And they have programs that let libraries send their discards in and receive some money for that. If your governing body doesn't like that idea of getting a check, you can also sometimes take advantage of their programs where they have a relationship with your vendor and you can get credit for new materials. So that's another thing you can do. So the last thing I want to say is it's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture and get focused on decisions about individual items. But really, weeding is about so much more than that. And doing this in a planned and intentional way really allows you to diversify your collections and make sure that they reflect your community. So we have a tendency in our profession that some would describe as broccoli librarianship. I don't know if you've heard that term. That we want to tell people how to use our library and what kind of materials they should want from us and how they should use them. And that really doesn't work for our patrons at all. So at our library, sort of on the back of our weeding program, we're starting to reorganize our spaces as well. So we're pulling away from devoting the bulk of our shelving to adult materials in general and to adult nonfiction materials in specific. We've had a couple of cities build new libraries in the past few years, which has been great, and the designs have really been changing. So they've now, most of the newer libraries have at least equal shelf space devoted to children's and adult materials. So that's something to look at. We're also looking at our reference collections and circulating most of those materials and rethinking how patrons use those. We want to get the maximum use out of something, not just sit it on a shelf till it's no longer of use, as Stella was talking about. And because we are weeding and because we are reorganizing, we're able to make room for special collections that we've never had before and expand our world language collections as well. So those are some of the possibilities that come from weeding. And this kind of reorganizing and rethinking of your space really can't happen without a solid program of weeding.
Alrighty, so once you guys have your plan for how you're going to weed and all of that stuff, you need to get staff buy-in. Staff buy-in is super important, and sometimes it's really difficult. So in order to get staff buy-in, you need to start. You need to work from the top down. So the important thing to do is know where your organization as a whole stands on weeding. So you're not just going to go, oh, I'm going to weed all the books in our library. No, don't start that way. What you need to do is find out where your organization stands on weeding as a whole. You're going to find out your collection development policy. Hopefully it's online. It might not be, but make sure that you read that and you know what the goal is for your collection. And you're also going to want to know your organizational goals so that your weeding follows all of those. And you might have to manage up. So it's possible that maybe you're sitting here and you're a library student or you're a library page, or you are just one librarian in one branch, and you're going to have to convince somebody above you that weeding is a good idea. And I promise you, weeding is a great idea. And you can do that. It is possible. And once you have all of that down, then it's time to meet with your staff. So you might have to convince your branch manager, but you can do it, I promise, because weeding is a super good idea. So once you meet with your branch manager, then all the staff has to meet together. And when you're meeting with your staff, the most important thing is that you have a strong pitch. So you need to go in with data that's going to help your weeding cause. So something like circulation for comparable branches that outperform your branch, maybe, or your system. Something like other systems before and after a big weeding. So you can look at, here are the numbers of books they have, here's their circulation before and after. So maybe something like Contra Costa, if they did their big weeding. When we do weeding, our numbers of books go down, our turnover goes up, and our circulation goes up. So that probably will happen for you guys too. So that's something that you want to bring to your staff. Examples of books with bad information you can take to the meeting with you. I bet you have some of those on your shelf. Maybe something that says, the Red Sox haven't won a World Series since 1918. Or something that says Pluto is the 9th planet. Those are great things that you could take in. And so if you have that and you're going in with a strong pitch, then your staff is more likely to get on board with you and you get that staff buy-in. Oh, good. I was worried what that next one was. So I love puffins. So you want to go in and ease their fears, but let them talk to you. Let them tell you, these are the things that are the terrible things that are going to happen when we weed. And you can tell them because nothing terrible is going to happen when you weed. Only fantastic things are going to happen when you weed. So you can tell them, oh, yeah, this is what has happened in other branches. This is what has happened in other systems. You can tell them it's easier to shelve. Oh, I love telling people that because that gets into their mercenary hearts. Because I know I have one. Like, what is this going to do for me? It's going to make your job and your life easier. It's going to make the library cleaner and smell nice when you get rid of those yucky books. It's going to make it easier to browse for your patrons who maybe can get books off the top and bottom shelves. It's going to give them better, more up-to-date info, so it helps you as a worker, it helps your community, and if you're helping your community, you're helping yourself. And make sure that they get to talk to you about all of those pros and cons, and that you completely ease their fears, because later, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, they're going to be communicating with the public about weeding. So you want to make sure that they're on board with you. Also, communication is really important with your community partners, because you can take the books that you have that are in good condition still, that aren't circulating, and you can give them to other places. You need to communicate with other branches in your system if you have them, because maybe it doesn't circulate really well with you because you're in a rural community, but maybe those books would do really well in the city, or vice versa. So make sure you communicate with them. And please, if you have one, communicate with your collection development department. They can help you print out different lists. As a collection development librarian, I go to libraries after hours and help weed their collection while patrons aren't there. I can't promise you that your collection development department will do that, but they might, and it's really a great help. So communication is really important with all levels and all departments. So once you have all of that ready, you're going to make a plan with your staff. Ooh, I went too far, sorry. Ooh, okay, there we are. So the plan that you need is a timeline and end goals. So is your end goal, you're going to get rid of books that are 10 years and older, 10 years old and older? Are you going to do your dead list? Are you going to weed on condition? Yes, you are. One thing that I read was never put a damaged book back on the shelf, ever. You should tell everybody that all the time. Pages should know, never put a damaged book, or shelvers, never put a damaged book back on the shelf. You're going to decide which sections you're going to do first, which are most important, and then, how long it's going to take. And you should also, at the beginning, determine what your success looks like. Is better circ? Is it more space for new things? Maybe you have decided that you want to start circulating musical instruments, or you want to add more Blu-ray, or you want to do play-away, so you're going to need to make space in your branch for that. Is it a clean collection? A beautiful, clean collection? That might be something too. So determine what success looks like at that meeting as well. And then hopefully you're ready to start weeding. So then the next thing is, once you've started weeding, the public might notice, and they might start getting worried. And so what you say to the public can make the difference between creating a terrible, angry mob and having a happy and supportive community. So you always want to accentuate the positive. Even if you think there are negative things about weeding, which I do not think there are any, but you might happen to, don't talk about those. There's no reason to. You want to talk about, what did you accomplish? The benefits that this weeding made possible. So were you able to get new formats or new things into the library? Were you able to do new services or bring new books in because you were able to bring in new books? Were you able to diversify your collection? Maybe 30 years ago when you first made your plan, the community looked one way, and now the community looks completely different, and you want to bring in different types of books to represent your community better. That's a great way to do it, is to weed your collection so you can bring in a lot more new books, or new whatever. You can talk about how weeding has saved the library money. I read a study that each book that sits on your shelf every year costs over $4 because of building costs and staffing costs and all of that. So, for instance, my library has a little bit more than 10% dead items, which is a really good goal to hit. But I added that up. That's over $600,000 worth of books just sitting for the price of sitting there, not talking about the price of the book at all, but just sitting on the shelf. That's a lot of money. So you can talk to your customers about that. You can say, oh, we were able to take those books and, like, for instance, we give them to our Health and Human Services partners, and they give them away at their family resource centers. You can say something like that. You can say we gave them to students at schools because you did. That's why you have the plan in the first place. So you can talk about all these great things, and when your patrons hear that or when your customers hear that, they go, oh, something wonderful happened, and they get behind you, and they're supporting you instead of getting angry. And I can't guarantee 100% that all of them will do that, but you're gonna get 90% of people behind you pretty quickly. So the last thing that I would say is have your staff practice what they're gonna say. I noticed in my branches that somebody will come in and they'll talk to a student worker, and the student worker will say something to them, and that patron will call the director and say, your librarian told me this, because our patrons don't necessarily differentiate. They think anybody who works in the library is a librarian and is in charge. I'm not sure why, but I've had that experience. So I think the best thing to do is make sure that everybody knows, here are the good things about weeding, and this is why we're doing it. And then your student workers aren't going to say, oh, I don't know why we got rid of this stuff. I think it was a terrible idea. Everybody will be on board, and everybody will be able to say, here are the wonderful things that happen when we weed our collection. So then, I know I said that was my last point, haha. But another thing that will really help is a slow and steady pace, if you're able to. Sometimes you have to get rid of your shelving, or you're moving to a new space. We moved one of our libraries to a new space. We had to get rid of 50% of our collection in like 2 months. And I will tell you, our circulation went up 50% after we did that. It was amazing. Oh my goodness. So we had to get rid of 50% of our collection in 2 months, and everybody noticed, and it was amazing. They kind of had a freak out, but we were able to ease their fears. But if you can do slow and steady, your patrons probably won't even notice. So that helps as well. Okay.